Hi, I just have a couple of additional general biology topics to cover before we move into chemistry. So first, I want to talk about how organisms are classified. And the first guy to come up with this classification system was a man named Linnaeus. So it is called the Linnaean classification system. And it starts with the most inclusive and goes to the least inclusive. So domain would contain the largest number of organisms, whereas species is the most specific category of organization. And to be the same species, you have to be able to mate and produce fertile offspring, as we said in the previous lecture. So that would be the most specific. So this example uses humans and starts with domain. So domain eukaryota, all eukaryotes are in this domain. So that would be all plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So this is a pretty big category of classification, but that's where we are classified because we are animals and that is our kingdom. We're in the animal kingdom, and our phylum is Chordata, class Mammalia. We're in the primate order, the Hominidae family, so we are hominids, genus Homo, and species is Sapiens. So over on the side, if you want to read all of these, it tells why we're in those categories. But it's important to know this order of classification. So I might ask you, what is the correct order of classification? And you would have to list them in order. There are a lot of mnemonic devices for remembering this. When I was in college, it started with kingdom. So we said King Philip came over from Great Spain. There are a lot of other ones now that are some that are even vulgar, but pick one and go with it so that you remember the order of classification. The other important thing with classification is how do you write the scientific name of an organism? Because organisms are listed usually by their genus and species name, and it's important to know how to write that. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. So the way you would write Homo sapiens is our genus is always capitalized, just the first letter is capitalized, and species is not. So for all scientific organisms, all organisms, their scientific name is written this way. It's called binomial nomenclature, meaning two names. Okay, so genus and species. Genus, first letter is capitalized, species is not, and then it either has to be italicized or underlined. So we could underline Homo and underline sapiens. They would be two separate underlines. Okay. Also, once you've written Homo sapiens in a paper, you can write H sapiens after that. Okay, so it can be italicized or underlined. I've written an example here. So our doggies are Canis lupus, and the way you would write their scientific name is either like this with underline or like this italicized. Okay, so genus is capitalized, species is not. And that's important to know too. Going back real fast, the three domains of life. You should be familiar with the three domains. So bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotes. And remember in the last lecture, we talked about prokaryotes very briefly. Very simple in structure, all single celled, and their DNA is not contained in a nucleus. Whereas eukaryotes have complex cells with complex membrane-bound organelles, and they do have DNA enclosed in a nucleus. And most of them are multicellular, but the protists are a very big group of unicellular eukaryotes. But the ones we're probably more familiar with, such as the animals, the plants, and the fungi, those are mostly all multicellular. So those are the three domains of life. Okay, now I want to start talking about probably what's the most misunderstood concept in all of biology, and that is evolution. As I mentioned in the last video, evolution does not mean that monkeys became humans. Evolution is something else that's very specific. And today we are going to talk about the category of evolution called microevolution. But first I want to talk to you about what a gene is. You hear this term gene, I'm sure, a lot. And a gene is a region of DNA that codes for one trait. So if this is your entire chromosome, And this DNA is really tightly condensed in this picture of a chromosome. But if we unwind that, which we would need to do to make a protein, this would have to be all unwound, only one region of that codes for a specific trait. And what that really means is it codes for a protein. But that is a gene. A gene is a region of DNA that codes for one trait or one protein. We have different versions of those genes. So if this is a gene for eye color in humans, we know that we have different versions of that gene. And those different versions of that same gene are what we call alleles. You will hear this word allele and the other word gene a lot in this course. So alleles are different versions of the same gene. The example here is, this is the location for a gene for flower color on this particular plant. And there are two different alleles, purple and white. So in other words, two different versions of that flower color gene. Locus just means location. So it's saying this is the locus or location for the flower color gene, two different alleles, purple flower allele, white flower allele. So these two terms, gene and allele, are very important in the next conversation we're going to have about evolution. So microevolution very specifically means change in allele frequencies within a population over time. Population is the level at which evolution occurs. Okay, individuals do not evolve. You cannot, during your lifetime, change your genetic makeup. Change in allele frequency within a population means at given points in time, you can look at that population and you can choose any trait and look at how common different versions of that gene are within the population. So let's just pick our first example being something that's human related, sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease is a gene mutation that causes the red blood cells. I actually have a picture of this. It's a gene mutation that causes your red blood cells to have this abnormal shape. So this is a normal red blood cell. This is what's called a sickled red blood cell. And that is the result of a single base change on the DNA. So you can see at this spot on the gene for hemoglobin, this is the normal sequence, and you can see here that this is the change. What that does is it gives you a different amino acid in that protein chain, and that protein now folds differently. And we will talk about in a lot of detail how that happens when we talk about proteins. But it gives you a sickled red blood cell. So at any given time, it might be important from a human health perspective to know how many people in the population have this allele, the sickle cell allele. In other words, this is the same gene, this is the normal version of the gene, this is the abnormal version of the gene. It just so happens that if you have this abnormal version of the gene, you cannot be infected with what is one of the greatest killers on earth still today, and that is malaria. So if you have sickle cell disease and you have these abnormally shaped red blood cells, the Plasmodium parasite, it's an amoeboid parasite, it's a protist that infects the red blood cells. That's what malaria is caused by, as a protist. They can't infect these abnormally shaped red blood cells. So what happens is in parts of the world where malaria is very prevalent, people who have sickle cell disease actually have a survival advantage over those who don't, because malaria is actually more deadly than sickle cell disease if you don't have access to proper drugs to treat it. So in certain areas of the world, this allele is a lot more common in the population than the normal allele. Now here in the United States, where we don't have malaria, we would expect that normal red blood cell allele that causes normal hemoglobin is going to be way more common than the sickle cell allele. So looking at allele frequency in a population and how it changes over time, that is evolution. So now let's go back and look at the different ways that microevolution can happen. One of those ways is through mutations, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. We're going to talk a lot about natural selection, which I just actually gave you a good example of. Artificial selection, sexual selection, and then two other big ways that evolution can happen called gene flow and genetic drift. And then there are going to be two types of genetic drift, the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. Of all of these, we will spend the most time on natural selection. Mutations, I just talked to you briefly about when we used the sickle cell example. So mutations are random changes in DNA. And sometimes those changes have no benefit and they don't cause harm. So in other words, they're neutral mutations. Those happen all day, every day in your body. You can go out in the sun for an hour and you're going to have DNA mutations in your skin cells. And for the most part, those don't cause you any harm. Okay, some mutations can be beneficial. And if you watched the video on the rock pocket mouse and on lactose tolerance in humans, you saw two really good examples of a beneficial mutation. So in the mice, that mutation that caused some of them to have darker fur color ended up being beneficial. And it only ended up being beneficial for a very specific reason that we'll talk in more detail about. Okay, mutations are the only way that new alleles arise. Otherwise, everyone just keeps going with the same genes. But when a mutation happens, we now have a different version of that gene in the population. And if that can be passed on to offspring and it offers a survival advantage, it would possibly become more common over time. Okay, we already told this story. That's a really good example of a mutation. So Charles Darwin was the first person to come up with this most common way that evolution occurs, and that is through what we call natural selection. What this means is nature is selecting which traits offer a survival advantage. And Charles Darwin was actually studying theology. He wanted to become a priest. So Charles Darwin was not an atheist. In fact, he was just the opposite of that. Had a very strong belief in God. And he ended up, as a college student, going on an expedition to map the coast of South America, including some islands known as the Galapagos. And he made a lot of observations and collected a lot of organisms. Now, at this point in time, people didn't travel for fun. You had to have a reason, really, to travel. So going on this boat and collecting organisms at that point in time really wasn't done. But he was very interested in nature, so he did this. And he was really the first to notice some really important things that to us seem so obvious, but at the time, these things were really revolutionary. And the next thing is just a quote from him that's really important to understand. It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And really, it's this concept that we call adaptation. So those with adaptations to their environment are usually the ones who survive, and we'll talk more about that. As he collected and made this journey through the Galapagos and along the coast of South America, he made some really important observations. He noticed that, for the most part, offspring really resemble their parents. And at that point in time, of course, we had no idea what DNA was. So nobody knew how that happened. How is it that offspring look like their parents? He noticed that within a population of organisms, there is variation. Okay, so just looking at them physically, not even looking at the DNA level, just looking at them physically, you know there's variation. And most populations of organisms actually produce more individuals than can actually survive. He concluded that those individuals with traits that make them better suited to their environment will survive and reproduce more. So the survival part isn't actually nearly as important as the reproduction part. This reproduce more is the key part of natural selection. Because if these organisms survive and reproduce, they will pass on those beneficial traits to their offspring. And over time, more individuals in the population are going to have those beneficial traits. In other words, those beneficial alleles become more common in the population over time. That is what we call natural selection. Nature, or the environment, is determining which traits offer a survival advantage. And those beneficial traits are called adaptations. You're adapting to the environment. So think about something just as simple as a duck, okay? Imagine an eagle lands on the water and a duck lands on the water. Okay, the duck is obviously more equipped for swimming on the surface of the water, just as an eagle is more equipped for soaring and capturing prey. His claws, his beak, everything is designed for his lifestyle. A duck has this big filter feeding beak and he has webbed feet. Those are adaptations. Those animals are very specialized to their environment. And the way that happened is over time, those individuals who had the traits that were best for that environment are the ones who survived and reproduced. And when you look across the environment today, you can name thousands of specializations in organisms that make them more suited to their environment. Differential reproductive success. That's an important term in natural selection, because what this means is not everyone is having the same level of reproductive success. Natural selection assumes that those with the beneficial traits are going to survive and reproduce more. It's also important to note that natural selection is not random. So what caused those different alleles to arise might be random through mutation, but natural selection is moving in one direction or the other. It's saying this allele is more beneficial and this one isn't. So it's not random. Also, it's important to note that the environment is constantly changing. So anything that offers a survival advantage at one point in time might actually be a disadvantage at another point in time. Okay, so let's talk about those videos that you watched. I'm going to start with the rock pocket mouse. In the rock pocket mouse story, it was originally a sandy desert strata on which those mice lived, but then there was volcanic activity. Okay, and that volcanic activity was only 1,000 years ago. And that's pretty crazy. That's not that long ago when you think about the age of the Earth. So 1,000 years ago, there was this volcanic activity, and now we have all this lava rock. And now the light mice are more easily seen by predators, and they're going to get eaten. And if it wasn't for that random mutation that caused some of those mice to have a darker fur color, those mice might have gone extinct. You know, they would have had to have some type of behavioral change to be hiding in caves and not be out at the same time as the predators, or something would have had to occur. Now they're very camouflaged on the sand, the lighter mice, but the selective pressure for that dark fur color to offer an advantage was the predator. If there weren't any predators, even with lava, there would be no advantage to having dark fur versus light fur. Okay, so if those guys were at the top of the food chain, there would be no advantage to them being camouflaged on the rock. So the selective pressure was predation. Those predators are what is offering the opportunity for that trait to be advantageous. Without that selective pressure, one fur color doesn't offer an advantage over the other. So the whole idea is more of the mice that were camouflaged with the dark color on the lava survived and reproduced, and over time on those lava flows, that became the most common allele for fur color. So the most common version of that gene. If you go back in the sandy areas, the light fur is still the most common. I think that's a pretty amazing example of natural selection. And in fact, in the video, they show you the exact gene mutation that took place, which is pretty amazing. And they also showed you that a similar mutation took place in another lava flow area, which is pretty crazy. So adaptation, that is really that change that is offering the survival advantage. It's the beneficial trait. Selective pressure, Okay, so in the story I just told, the predators are giving one genotype, one allele, an advantage over the other. Differential survival and reproduction. Some individuals are going to survive and reproduce more. And we call that increase in reproduction, we call that biological fitness. So in biology, what we call fitness isn't how fast you can run or how strong you are, it's how many babies you have. So whoever has the most offspring has the highest biological fitness. So here's the link to the Rock Pocket Mouse video if for some reason you didn't watch it already, but the link is also on Canvas. I'm going to talk about lactose tolerance in humans in a minute. This is another classic example of natural selection. So before the Industrial Revolution, the white allele for scale color in these moths was more common. So two possible alleles for scale color in these moths, dark and light, and they live on birch trees. So before the Industrial Revolution in England, the lighter mice were the more common because as you can see, they're more camouflaged. Well, guess what? We started polluting. The birch tree bark turned dark, and now the dark ones became more common. So selective pressure would be, again, the predator. And what offered a survival advantage at one point in time actually became a disadvantage at another point in time. So the environment is constantly changing. I'll go to sexual selection in a minute. I just want to talk about lactose tolerance. I think the video did a really great job of explaining this. And to me, it's really amazing that, again, this mutation was random and it would not have offered an advantage to certain humans if we hadn't started domesticating cows and raising them for milk. So even if we had just raised them for meat, it would not have affected whether that gene offered an advantage or not. The only way that offered a survival advantage is because humans started raising cows. And now people who could digest milk as adults because of this random mutation had a huge survival advantage. Imagine a harsh winter, the crops are all dead, and your only source of glucose is to be able to drink milk. And as they explained in the video, lactose is actually a disaccharide. It's two sugars bonded together. So it's the lactose and glucose bonded together. That can't get into your cells. Okay, that two sugars bonded together, a disaccharide, can't get into your cells. We have to have an enzyme called lactase to break that apart into the two smaller sugars. And now these two smaller sugars can get into your cells and give you energy. Without that enzyme to break that bond, you can't get it into your cells for energy. And you know, if you don't have that enzyme as an adult, you end up with all these digestive issues. It also allowed them to drink milk as a source of liquid because water was very contaminated then. It still is. I mean, there are many countries on earth that don't have a clean drinking water supply, and many, many deaths worldwide occur because of not having clean drinking water. So watch the video if you haven't. There is a lot going on in that story, but in that story, the selective pressure was probably starvation and probably, you know, just having that clean drinking water supply. And without humans domesticating cows and using them for milk, this would have never offered a survival advantage. If you are of Northern European origin or from a certain area of Africa, then it's most likely that you can digest milk as an adult. There are other parts of the globe where hardly anyone has this mutation, and you probably can't digest milk as an adult. So not being able to digest milk, that is the normal human gene. That's the normal allele. The abnormal allele is actually the one that allows you to still produce lactase enzyme as an adult. So that's an awesome example of natural selection in humans. Just like the sickle cell disease is a very good example of natural selection in humans. Okay, sexual selection. Sexual selection is pretty cool because this is that one gender or the other is choosing which traits are going to be passed on to the next generation. So in this example, this bird is doing a really cool dance for his lady friend there to try to show her how fit he is to mate with her. And she's going to decide whether he mates or not. So in some organisms, it's usually the female who is deciding who is going to get to pass their genes on to the next generation. So sometimes allele frequencies in a population can be altered by who the female is choosing and who she's not. I have a really fond memory of one time at the Wild Animal Park, which I know is now called the Safari Park, but I still call it Wild Animal Park. There was this one hooved animal, I don't remember what he was, but they were actually extirpated, meaning extinct in the wild. And they were having really limited breeding success at the safari park with this animal. And they noticed that when they did artificial insemination with this one guy's sperm, that the babies were all super healthy and strong, and they survived and had babies of their own. But the guy that all the females wanted to mate with, his babies weren't as healthy, and there was a high mortality rate in those offspring. And so one year at Christmas time, just kind of being funny, they took these battery operated Christmas lights and put them on the horns of the guy whose babies were super healthy, but the ladies didn't really want to mate with him. And suddenly all the girls wanted to mate with him because of the Christmas lights on the horn. So I think that is being one of my favorite examples of sexual selection. They finally realized he was the one once he had the Christmas lights on his horns. I won't make you watch this video, it's just of this guy dancing. But this is called a bird of paradise, and if you ever want to see a really cool bird dance, you can look it up on YouTube. Okay, so which bird has the greater biological fitness? So Barry the bird, he has a big, beautiful tail, all these long tail feathers, and the ladybirds love him, and he mates with many, many girls over the years, and he has over 200 children. But unfortunately, because of his big tail feathers, he gets picked off by a predator. So he only lives to age 3. And his cousin, Benny the bird, he has really small tail feathers. He only has 22 children, but he lives to the ripe old age of 12. So he way outlives his cousin Barry by 9 years. But Barry has over 200 children. So which guy has the greater biological fitness? It would be Barry. So biological fitness is how many offspring you have. Doesn't matter if you live a short life, if you've reproduced and passed on more of your genes to the next generation, you have the greatest biological fitness. Artificial selection is not random. This is humans choosing traits that they want to see in the next generation and only allowing those individuals to reproduce. So that's how we got modern corn. And that's how we got almost all of our crop plants, is by artificially selecting certain traits and genetically manipulating these plants to be what they are. Believe it or not, golden beets were not found in the forest. We genetically manipulated plants to get to all of the crops we have today. So when you hear about genetically modified foods, all of our foods are genetically modified. It's a big farce, this whole fear of genetically modified foods. All food products that we eat are genetically modified. We don't have any crops today that are just found in the wild and we just eat them. That's also how we have our dogs. So very thankful for artificial selection if you have a dog or even a cat. All of those dogs that we have today, imagine everything from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane, all came from a wolf ancestor. And it's us taking traits that are beneficial or that we want to see in the next generation and only allowing the individuals with those traits to reproduce. That's called artificial selection. Okay, gene flow is when an organism that has a certain trait ends up going over to another population, and now he brings that trait with him. And now that trait becomes part of the population. So say that this population over here mostly just had this blue variant, and now some of the red guys come over here. Now they have this new gene in their population. and that's called gene flow. So gene flow really has to do with migration and animals moving around. And a lot of times that happens when environmental conditions change and now animals can move to a place they weren't before. And now these two populations can mingle and they bring those new traits with them. So you can read this slide. I don't read it to you. I'm going to drink some water while you're reading that. Okay, so the reason this can be debated whether a gene flow is random or not is because maybe only certain individuals can make it to the next population. So maybe that gene moved there because this guy had some ability to go over there and intermingle with the other population, whereas people or not people, but other animals or plants or whatever couldn't make the journey. This example of a bee carrying pollen from one flower to another, you know, that is really random in some ways, but in other ways it's not, because that flower that had the perfect structures to attract that bee is going to have an advantage over the flower that didn't perfectly attract that bee. So a lot of biologists disagree with whether that's random or not. So I wouldn't ask you if gene flow is random or not, because that's a little more controversial. This one, though, is totally random, genetic drift. Now, I don't like these two terms because gene flow and genetic drift, those can get confusing. Just think of this is organisms flowing over to the new population, whereas this is something different. So this is random fluctuations just due to chance. Okay, so this guy's walking down the street. This is a mean example. This guy's walking down the street. He steps on these insects and squishes them. And it's just random which ones he squished. Okay, he wasn't having any intention of pushing one or the other. So that's genetic drift. Two different subcategories of genetic drift. Bottleneck effect is there's some catastrophe that wipes out most of the population, and those individuals that are left don't represent the original diversity. So let's say a wildfire goes through an area and accidentally burns all the white-furred bunnies, and all that's left are the tan-furred bunnies. And it was totally random which ones got killed. Okay, founder effect is a similar situation, but say these guys, say that these are insects and they end up on a log that floats down the river, okay, and they end up now in this new place, and they're now the founding population. That founding population doesn't represent the original diversity. So you can see there's 6 blue ones and 1 yellow one. There were a lot more yellow ones in this original population. So founder effect is somehow this subgroup ends up going somewhere else by accident. And the individuals who went and founded this new area, they're the founders, they don't have the same genetic diversity. Okay, so that's it for evolution. And thank you. Now we are going to move on to chemistry next week. Bye.